Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is in the book of Luke, and today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream and Zack Unkenholz. And our question today comes from our reading of Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. And it says, Jesus said, "There was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. As Lazarus lay there longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Finally, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to sit beside Abraham at the heavenly banquet. The rich man also died and was buried, and he went to the place of the dead. There in torment he saw Abraham in the far distance with Lazarus at his side. The rich man shouted, 'Father Abraham, have some pity. Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am in anguish in these flames.' But Abraham said to him, 'Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted, and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is here being comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides, there is a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over from you to here. No one can cross over from here to there.' And then he asked, 'Well, send, Father Abraham, please send him to my father's home, for I have 5 brothers, and I want to warn them so they don't end up in this place of torment.'" There's a lot, there's a lot of things that we could decipher out of this. And I'm always scared about taking too strong of a theological position out of a single parable that Jesus is telling, or story that Jesus is telling. But an assumption I made growing up was that if you went to heaven, it was a heaven or hell thing, even though I don't believe he's describing heaven or hell here. Maybe he is, maybe not. That certainly has evolved at this point. But he's certainly describing after death. I think I always grew up with the assumption, and I'm pretty positive I would have heard this preached somewhere, that those in heaven cannot see those in hell. And I'm using these terms loosely, please, for anybody listening. I'm using these terms loosely, but those are easy names to use. Those in heaven could not see those in hell because there would be no tears in heaven. And if there are no tears in heaven, if you saw your loved ones in hell, you would certainly cry. But this passage at least indicates there's a one-way view. Those in hell can see those in heaven, or those in torment can see those at peace or at rest with Abraham. So my question today is, and this may take us a few minutes, can the dead see one another even though they are separated?
So I would say that if Jesus is telling a real story, then we believe it to be that yes, that's true. But and I've heard different arguments for whether this is Jesus telling a true story that actually happened, or if this is a parable. Because as we've been just reading, he's been telling these different parables, which are fictional. They're just to give an idea. But then with this one, what makes this one different is that even though it's still within those, is that he used the name Lazarus, whereas he never uses the name in any of the other parables.
They're all very generic.
They're very generic.
Yeah, rich man, lost coin, lost sheep, older son, younger son.
Yeah.
No names.
And there are many theologians, there are many people that do believe this is a true story, that he's telling a real story, but we can't, I don't know, it's like, and I can't tell, and he was just telling parables, and so, because if he is telling a true story, then I believe that, yes, then that means they would be able to see each other, but I've heard the same arguments that you have of that, if there are no tears in heaven, then why would, if we saw our loved ones suffering, then, wouldn't that make us suffer as well? Wouldn't that be a terrible thing to
Or did we
to
become heartless?
well, that's the thing. We no longer have hearts, we're just souls now. But I don't know. But I think that I'm more of the belief that this is a parable, and he's giving an example. And I think because it gives, you know, Maybe it's one of those things I think with every parable we can read into every minor little detail, of like, with like the feeding the pods to the pigs. Oh, what do the pods mean? And what does this mean? And you could read into all these little tiny things. And I think that and I think that sometimes there are things you can break down from these parables um, but I think that sometimes, with this, if we read too much into it, we're thinking, oh man, like, well, that means that there's this theological implication, there's this. I think that the general idea is clearly shown in this, and that not just like, oh, if you're rich you go to hell, if you're poor you go to heaven, but that because even Abraham was not poor, but even with that, looking at that, I think it's important to see the key themes of this are clearly shown. I think that's what's most important about it, but I think it's still interesting to talk about. But I can't say I know whether or not we see our loved ones in hell or not.
Or just people in
Or
general,
just people.
not necessarily. Alyssa, your take.
Yeah, I'm going on this as a parable, and that's reading too much into what we know about the next life. I went and got N.T. Wright has a quote about it. To take the scene of Abraham, the rich man, and Lazarus literally is about as sensible as trying to find out the name of the prodigal son. Jesus simply doesn't say very much about the future life. He was, after all, primarily concerned to announce that God's kingdom was coming on earth as in heaven. And I think when I was reading this parable this time, what kind of struck me wasn't yet there is the upside down kingdom, the fact that the rich man is suffering and the poor man is being elevated. I think, that's the opposite of how things were on earth. But what strikes me is please send, him to my father's home. And Abraham's like, it wouldn't even matter. And I think that when we think about evangelism, that sometimes there are just people and situations that we can talk to a blue in the face and it's not going to change their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And unless the Spirit moves in their hearts, there's
Right.
nothing that
Unless
we can
they
do. I
believe.
think that that's one of the takeaways from this, at least.
So if it is a parable and we can't read too much into it, okay, and I don't think we can. I mean, I do think him naming Lazarus complicates it. Him assigning a name to it, it complicates it. But what should we take away? What is he trying to say?
He's trying to say that, Lazarus was humble, and he didn't, and he only had God, right? Like that's really all he had. Whereas this rich man, he lived a life for himself. He was not humble, and in a sense, it seems that he didn't feel that he needed God. But now that he's in hell, he realizes, well, he's just even asking for Lazarus's help, because he has nothing. And um, so I would say that I think that the lesson in this is that even if you have all the desires of your heart in this world, you don't carry that on to the next. And it makes you realize Jesus trying to tell us what is important in this life. Because Lazarus had what was important in this life, even if it didn't seem like he had anything.
I think it's also interesting that Abraham calls him son and knows that he is in some way, like he has some sort of, like in verse 25, Abraham said to him, son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted. I don't know, that really struck me this time. I'm not sure if I can pull out any great application from that, but there's something there there was the man knew enough and had enough that he could have made maybe a different decision.
This gets into some dicey pieces here, what I'm getting ready to say about eternal security and salvation and all of those things. You use the terminology son. Gosh. Jesus can't be talking about salvation in the context of how we know it, because he's talking to Jewish people pre-resurrection. he's making this description. It seems to me that he would be talking to people who were God's chosen people, the Jewish people. That's who he's talking to. So that is his audience. Both of these men are God's chosen people. That's the assumption I'm making. Okay, I don't believe. I think if the rich man was a Gentile and the poor man was a Jew, we would have gotten that kind of information. I think he's talking to Jewish people, and as we're recording this past Sunday, we would have the Sunday before we would have preached from Zechariah, and multiple times in Zechariah he talks about how you treat those on the margins, those that, and that's a constant theme throughout Scripture. That seems to be a real test of those of, I don't want to use the word believer because that's a different term than a Jewish person. We equate the two, but I don't think they're the same. But it seems to be a constant test of your faith. How do you treat these people? We have to believe, or no, we don't have to. I make the assumption that both of them claimed faith. I make that assumption. Otherwise, because Lazarus didn't get in just because he's poor. I can't read the story that way. He didn't get in just because he's poor. There has to be something more to it. And the rich man didn't get sent to the place of torment just because he was rich. I can't read that into it. So there had to be something more about practice, that they're given an opportunity. So if I'm up here and this person's down here, my obligation is to try to pull them up to where I'm at, to help them to at least meet their, basic needs, the basic needs of humanity, instead of taking advantage of them. So I see that piece play out in the story. The other piece that I think seems to be clear is that the separation is torment and rest. So whether it looks like a banquet table and flames of fire, I don't know, but he clearly says, I'm tormented here. Mm-hmm. And the other one he sees resting at the table of Abraham, Mm-hmm. And so I do think we can take that away. Whether they can see one another, whether we can see one another in eternity or not, it certainly is going on here. There's this conversation going on. I'm not 100% sure that I'm there, but I can see why you could make that case. But the other thing that I see as we get to the end is that faith and following what God desires for our life is an individual decision. And there is nothing. Abraham's case is if they didn't listen to the prophets, like they already have it. If they mm-hmm. didn't listen to the prophets, why is a dead man coming back to life? And some of how I read that is the Old Testament points to Jesus. The people who wanted to believe in Jesus believed in Jesus, but the people who didn't, him coming back to life didn't change their mind. It made them dig in their heels. They just sat in and said, we're not. And what Abraham, I think, is saying is somebody coming back from the dead is not going to change anybody's mind. And we see that played out in Jesus' life. Him coming back from the dead doesn't. The people who wanted to not believe didn't believe, and so it's a complicated story,
especially with an unlikely messenger. Because if the messenger coming back was the poor man with sores,
right,
and he comes back in that form,
why are they going to listen to him?
Why would they listen to him when he was there? And if he was at the brother's gate, then they already knew him, and
they probably passed by him and ignored him
and
themselves.
Did the same thing.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And he suddenly does have compassion. Mm-hmm. It does seem to be clear that he has some change of heart, and it's interesting that I see this. Like I know someone that comes to church here right now, and they're not a believer, and they don't want to be a believer. As a matter of fact, they hate church. That's the truth of it. but they want their children to believe. And so they make sure their kids are in church, which is the weirdest. Like, that's a weird thing to me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But that's what we see here. He chose not to believe, but he wants to make sure his other family does. So.
Even as we were just saying that, I'm reminded of Joshua and how Joshua, as they've finally entered the promised land, and yet God's chosen people still choose to go back to these old gods, or the gods of the Cushites, or whoever is there where they're living. And he's like, have you not learned anything from our time of traveling, how God provided for us, and saying, you can go back to your gods, but like whatever God you want to worship. But as for me and my household, we'll worship the Lord, and it's some people just, they don't learn, Well,
thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation in the book of Luke.